0407 hours, North Atlantic. The wind is a hard, salt-bitten hand on the surface, slapping whitecaps into ragged roughs. 32 merchantmen stack into 4 columns, grey shapes half swallowed by a mist that glows with the weak, hooded light of smothered lamps. Their wakes are chalk lines drawn by an impatient child. An escort corvette shoulders through the night on the starboard bow, the hull as humble as a tugboat and as dangerous as a trap. And from somewhere inside her, once every few seconds, the sea clicks with a patient metronome. It is the ping of Azdic, never melodramatic, never kind going out and coming back, counting range and bearing the way a doctor counts heartbeats before declaring a diagnosis. Beneath the convoy, trimmed like a diver adjusting his weight belt, a Type 8 U-boat rides at periscope depth. The captain keeps his eye pressed to a wet ring of glass and swivels as the swell lifts and lowers the world into and out of the narrow circle he owns. His watch officer murmurs bearings the way a priest murmurs the liturgy. The boat hums with small, practical noises, electric motors grinding soft as a cat's purr, a pump somewhere in the bow, murmuring about a leak that isn't really a leak, the breath of 24 men trained to inhale at the same time and exhale as if they feared the sea might overhear. The ping finds them again and again and again. And each time the captain recalls the old ritual of endurance, the one drilled into him off Danzig and polished in the frozen miles west of Ireland. Let the escorts overshoot, let them bleed their charges into a guessing game astern, survive the thunder, wait for the silence that follows, change depth and course during their blindness, and when they come back for the re-attack, be somewhere the last explosion has already erased from their minds. He has memorized this choreography. It has kept him alive. Yet on the surface, the choreography has been rewritten by men he will never meet. On the Potkerd, Corvette's bridge, condensation beads the metal rim of the voice pipe and drips to the deck like nervous sweat. The captain's hand is easy on the combing, fingers quiet, eyes doing the old arithmetic with the calm of a man who has run it often enough to know it in his bones. The operator sings out small changes that mean large things bearing steady, range closing, and the helmsman answers with a nudge that brings the bow not away from the contact but toward it, as if the ship intends to pass straight through the spot where the echo lives. The crew on the forecastle stand by a modest, ugly sculpture, 24 stubby tubes set in a shallow oval, angled out and forward like the bristles of some iron animal paused just before anger. No one expects a grand noise from it. Indeed, when the captain closes the key, what follows is not a roar but a series of clipped expulsions, the deep cough of pistons relieved of their burden, and a scatter of small shapes arc into the night ahead of the ship, disappear into the water with the neat elegance of stones thrown by a bored god. And then the ocean, which has always been noisy with its own body, begins to feel like a room in which someone has closed the door on purpose. Below, the U-boat crew feel the pings continue without flinching or fading, which is wrong. The men have trained their nerves to ride out violence, but they have not trained them to climb the staircase of steady tapping that does not yield to the respectful pause depth charges, force on every ear and every instrument. There is no thunder to brace for, no instant of universal baptism when the sea turns to fists and everyone clenches his jaw at the same time and then opens his mouth for the pressure. There is only the captain's hand tightening on a rail he cannot see, and the first impact, a compact, metallic blow that sounds like someone striking the hull with a steel hammer from the other side. It is not dramatic enough to terrify, it is surgical enough to convince. The second and third detonations arrive not like a chorus but like decisions, and then the lights flicker as if trying to choose sides, and then gravity loses its mind for a quarter second, while a man near the sonar cabinet reaches for a panel that has already decided it no longer wishes to live. In the forest of gauges, a needle twitches through a meaning and stops, and in a part of the captain's brain that has been working flawlessly for months, a quiet door closes. This is the thesis the night insists upon. The Allies changed anti-submarine war from a theatre of hope to a practice of geometry. The Hedgehog mortar is not the biggest weapon on the water, and it does not sound like fear in the way a 300-pound depth charge sounds like fear. It speaks another language. It speaks of probability multiplied by continuity. It refuses to trade contact for spectacle. It insists on small explosions only if steel has been touched. The sea detests guarantees, but it loves math. The crews who learned to love the math won the argument with the Atlantic more quickly than the men who tried to menace it with noise. Consider the caravan of numbers this change pulls behind it. A depth charge is an extravagant machine for making temporary blindness. It asks an escort to dump raw, explosive confidence into a patch of water whose best description is a guess, then to steer away from its own danger and spend 2 or 5 or 10 minutes reacquiring what it intentionally threw away. The kill envelope, measured not in adjectives but in yards, remains narrow for hull-breaking damage, and unless an unlucky cylinder happens to detonate within that band, the result is a billowing forest of bubbles, a snowstorm of false returns, and a target who has moved from where you decided he must be when you set your depth. It is courage, yes. It is also self-sabotage. Hedgehog is courage revised by respect for sensors. The projectiles are small warheads that do not confuse the sea unless they have earned the right. Thrown ahead of the bow into a tight, pre-computed ellipse, they fall quickly through the volume your sonar returns insist upon. If they miss, there are no lies, no acoustic blizzard, no righteous fog. The ocean remains legible. If they hit, they speak sharply and briefly, and the men on the bridge can hear the truth without looking for oil or fragments. That is a procedural revolution disguised as a hardware tweak. When the water does not lie to you after a miss, you can fire again while your contact solution is still fat with nutrition. When the water tells the truth about a hit, you do not need to pretend. Either way, you have shortened the argument with the enemy from a night-long debate to a minute-long cross-examination. There is a quieter revolution here which the enemy feels first as a mood. U-boat captains had trained their bodies to a ritual. Brace, endure, wait out the noise, guess at the attacker's exhaustion, maneuver during the attacker's blindness, survive. In that grammar, the verb to endure conjugates into hope. Hedgehog removes the space where hope lives. The pings do not respect the pause. They do not let the captain rebuild his mental plot of the escort's incompetence. They do not give him the seconds he requires to make a knuckle of water with a harsh turn, or to plumb it through a layer and sit on the quiet side of physics. The old sanctuary, the roaring, white cathedral of bubbles in which anything can be believed because nothing can be known, is not built tonight. There are only precise detonations arranged not like an argument but like a proof, and the proof concludes not with drama but with a verdict. So this is where we begin, and the beginning matters. Not with size or spectacle, but with a small weapon that protects the only thing the hunter truly owns, which is his stream of information. The Atlantic demands tribute from everyone who crosses it. Hedgehog replaced the tribute of courage with the tithe of attention. The crews who learned to pay in attention instead of courage did not have to be braver than the men they replaced. They had to be truer to their instruments, more faithful to the geometry, and less seduced by thunder. If you want to know what changed the war under the waves, stop counting pounds of explosive and start counting seconds of continuous contact. The numbers will tell you why silence that can be read is more lethal than noise that forces you to shut your eyes. By dawn, the convoy will still be crawling east, and the corvette's deck will still be wet with a night that never warmed. Men will drink tea that tastes like rope and tin. Someone will write a few dry lines in a log that will outlive him. The U-boat, if it is dead, will not complain. If it is only hurt, it will learn the new arithmetic before it leaks itself into history. Either way, the ocean will keep its secrets, except the one it has already confessed. Probability, tended carefully, is stronger than drama. There is a comforting lie at sea that every sailor learns to repeat on bad nights. If you do enough hard things loudly enough for long enough, the ocean will relent. Depth charges were that lie turned into barrels and fuses. They made men feel decisive precisely because they made the water convulse. And when the water convulsed, it was possible to believe that something important had happened below, even when nothing had. In the ledger of a convoy battle, belief appears as ink. In the reality where steel meets pressure and welds either crack or hold, belief is just breath. The early years of the Atlantic campaign are the story of brave breath being traded for bad odds. Strip the fight down to the only variables that matter, and the indictment writes itself. A hunter at sea needs to keep knowing where the prey is, narrow the uncertainty around that knowledge, and convert the shrinking cloud of probably here into a pattern of explosions that has a high chance of intersecting the hull. Contact continuity, geometry, and re-attack time. Those are the terms that decide whether a night ends with a wreck or a rumor. Depth charges asked attackers to violate all three. As soon as an escort committed to a run, the ship's own speed and the geometry of the racks forced the blasts to happen behind the sonar, not in front of it. The ship outran its beam. The operator watched his clean trace turn to a smear as the ship sailed past the contact, and the exploding cylinders bloomed into acoustic weather. The very act of striking severed the one thread that tied the attacker to truth. If the charges were set too shallow, the water raged a few meters above a boat, already slithering deeper. If they were set too deep, the blasts spent their anger in a place the target had abandoned while the operator's headphones filled with static. And when it was over, when the water stopped shaking and the deck stopped trembling, and men let go of railings that had pretended to be snakes, there began the long, humiliating loop. Circle, reacquire, recalculate, reset, return. Minutes passed, and with minutes came error, and with error came endurance for the target and fatigue for the attacker. The siege mentality that followed was understandable. It spawned procedures that looked like discipline because they hurt. Drop more, drop deeper, sweep broader. None of it changed the arithmetic. The kill radius of a depth charged the distance at which shock would do fatal work to a pressure hull was small enough that an inaccurate plot squandered even a generous pattern. The ocean is a poor negotiator. It counts in yards, not in intentions. One can respect the men who executed those patterns with unmoving hands and still admit the truth their own after-action reports hinted at. Attack success rates were meager under the best circumstances, and the re-attack delays that followed every miss gave the target time to build a runway of options. War against. Submarines conducted on that schedule is a war of theatre. Theatre does not sink boats. The men who refused to be satisfied with theatre were not magicians with new explosives. They were readers of graphs. In tiny classrooms on cold British coasts, and in the plotting rooms of escort groups who had seen too many convoys mauled in the Black Pit, the same question kept surfacing with the stubbornness of a buoy. What if we didn't go blind? If the scope of your weapon is not merely to hurt but to end a target's options, the first option to end must be your own tendency to erase your senses with your strike. The minute you accept that, the rest follows with the inevitability of algebra. The attack cannot be behind. It must be ahead. The explosion cannot be unconditional. It must be contingent on contact with the target's skin. The aftermath cannot be a blizzard. It must be silence that still carries meaning. Once those principles harden, hardware design becomes doctrine written in steel. There is a human reason this shift took time. Loudness is intoxicating. It persuades the tired, frightened mind that action must equal effect. The apprentice operator at an ASDIC set, barely 20, watched his display midnight after midnight until it felt like reading the inside of his eyelids. When the charges went, a part of him believed the war was finally happening. Hedgehog was the opposite of that persuasion. It demanded that men trust the patient feedback of pings and the sobering math of bearing rates. It made the story small, a bow that keeps its nose pointed at a tone, a set of projectiles that do not volunteer a spectacle, a trigger pulled at the instant the geometry says now, not the moment the gut demands catharsis. You can hear the difference in oral histories without needing to know the numbers. Crews who kept the old faith talk about giving them a bellyful. Crews who learned the new practice talk about holding the contact. One vocabulary is generous, with appetite. The other is austere with attention. Step aside from the rhetoric and listen to the water again. In the old choreography, you would watch a corrugated surface ride toward your transom while the charges went thunderous behind you. Your ears would fill with a roar that pretended to be victory, but was actually just the sea telling you to wait. In the new choreography, your bow was a pointer traveling across a page. You would aim not for a lump of coordinates where you hoped the target would be, but for the area where the 2-second-old echo insisted the target must be right now, and then you would paint that area with objects that fell faster than myth, and exploded only if they met something dense. If they touched nothing, you did not pretend. You fired again at a slightly revised spot informed by the ping that never left you. It was not a better show. It was a better procedure. Procedure is how empires outlast storms. The enemy felt the difference in his bones and pretended it was weather. In the first months, U-boat commanders registered the new pattern as a mood shift. They still heard the ping, but now the ping was a promise that did not break. They made their knuckles and blew their decoys. They put their boats through battery, hurting dives, and tried to hide beneath the manners of water. Yet the escorts were not following the old script. No blind, roaring intermission gave them a place to change costumes. The taps continued, unromantic and merciless, and then the sudden local wounding of the contact detonation arrived like a personal insult. There is no tradition for a blow that small and that final. There is no prayer you can complete in the time it takes. The ocean's noise theology had lost a parishioner. You can draw the curve of the war's mood if you like, from crisp confidence aboard U-boats that the old cycle could be endured, to a new uncertainty that the cycle wasn't a cycle anymore. Escort captains, once slaves to the re-attack loop, began to behave as though they had all the time they needed, precisely because they weren't wasting any. Time is elastic when you stop throwing it away. The math that resulted was boring in the most lethal way. Attacks per kill dropped. Confirmations accelerated. Missed, re-engaged immediately. Replaced lost contact after attack as the heartbeat of a night's narrative. Courage was still required because the sea does not respect the timid. But courage became a requirement of attention rather than a ritual of noise. A man who can stare at a returning ping and keep his hand light on the wheel while the old part of the brain screams for thunder is, in the universe of that night, braver than the man who rolls 10 barrels and waits to feel holy. So the indictment stands, and the transition becomes obvious. Depth charges were honest tools, used heroically in a framework that punished honesty and rewarded noise. Hedgehog was a modest machine that taught men to stand inside information until the enemy ran out of ideas. If you want to understand why one era of the Atlantic turns to another, read not the paean to explosive weight, but the quiet, cumulative lines in the logs where latency was shaved and contact persisted. Hope was beautiful and it sank a few boats. Math was boring and it ended a strategy. Innovation at sea rarely announces itself with trumpets. It arrives looking like a crate that nobody wants to sign for. Hedgehog looked like that at first. A frame of steel bolted to a blunt forecastle, a cluster of short tubes that seemed almost embarrassed by their own stubbiness, a tangle of cables and a firing key that took its dignity from the hand that would learn to trust it. You could walk past it on a pier, glance once and keep going, the way you might dismiss a lathe in a factory full of gleaming presses. Only when you watched it work, only when you saw the odd, forward-bent animal posture it gave a ship entering a fight, did its shape begin to make sense. Engineering is a language, and Hedgehog had a grammar that declared its theme in every line. Throw forward, keep contact, explode only on proof. The heart of the device was its projector, a spigot launcher in which each projectile sat like a candle on a short, thick pin. When the firing circuit closed, a cartridge in the projectile's tail expelled it off the spigot with a controlled, repeatable shove, imparting a velocity chosen to paint a particular footprint on the water ahead. Multiply that by 24 spigots arranged in an oval, and you had a ring of iron seeds flung into the sea, each bound by gravity to fall into a pattern the crew could visualize without closing their eyes. The pattern itself was not a guess. It was a reply to the mathematics of bearing error and target motion, the footprint broad enough to forgive a few degrees of uncertainty, dense enough that a cylinder 30 feet long with a beam of 19 feet could not slide between the seeds without brushing at least one as they sank. The projectile was no monster. Think of a steel cylinder roughly the size of a small barrel, with fins for stability, mass around 60 or 70 pounds, a modest charge nested up front, and, most crucially, a contact fuse that was both sensitive and stubborn, eager to work when it found steel and beautifully uninterested in exploding for anything less. It entered the water cleanly, tucked its nose, and began its work of falling. Sink rate mattered, and it mattered more than romance. At something on the order of 20 feet per second, the projectile turned seconds into vertical feet in a way that kept pace with a target in motion. Numbers, not adjectives, gave the weapon its stride, from splash to 200 feet in 10 seconds, to 300 inches 15, to 400 inches 20. In that time, a U-boat diving at a disciplined angle might steal depth but found it difficult to steal geometry. Falling objects do not negotiate. Because the projectile's temper was conditional explode on contact, remain a perfect gentleman, otherwise the surrounding water stayed legible. The sonar dome, attached to a ship that had fulfilled the doctrinal injunction to drive through the datum, kept its beam honest. The operator's pings did not vanish into a stadium of echoes. They came back with the same pathological honesty they had offered in the minute before the firing key closed. That preserved a conversation between bridge and set and projector deck, whose clarity is still startling when you listen to recordings from training exercises. Steady bearing, range closing, fire, silence, and in that silence information. If the pattern missed, the echoes returned with a clean face. If the pattern hit, the water snapped with local detonations that never lied about their reality. The difference in crew behavior begins here. Men who know within seconds whether they have succeeded or failed stop negotiating with their own desires. They stop making offerings to the sea in the hope that it will confirm their virtue. They start doing the next right thing immediately because the system has told them it is time. Everything about the hardware bent toward repeatability. The tubes were arranged to be loaded quickly by men wearing gloves in weather that punished fingers. The projectiles stacked in lockers close to hand. The fuses were designed to survive the rough courtship of salt, cold, and hurry. The firing system was built to speak to the bridge in plain language. Even the angle of the frame was a paragraph in doctrine. The bow had to own the patch of water where the pattern wanted to fall, and that required captains to resist the pre-Hedgehog urge to sheer off into a new run. Engineering encodes instruction when it is honest, and this device was honest. It told everyone within arm's reach exactly what to do in the order they needed to do it. A board full of chalk marks in a shore school could convert these traits into lines that looked like a plan. Put the ship at a closing course that keeps the contact in the center of the beam. Let your velocity place the ellipse of fall just ahead of the last best range. Assume the target's acceleration is not magical. Pull the key when the geometry tightens to a moment. This is dull only to people who have never tried to do a difficult thing in a hostile medium without lying to themselves. The men who did it for real learned to savor the absence of drama as a kind of abundance. On a winter night, sea spray cuts cheeks like a tailor who dislikes you, and the oilskin stiffens into a philosophy. In that place, it is not a flaw that the machine on your bow refuses to show off. It is a virtue. The design also reconciled with a fact escort crews never forgot. Sometimes you miss because the ocean, vast, layered, whimsical, makes a fool of any weapon that pretends to certainty. The gift Hedgehog gave was not perfection but tempo. A miss did not demand contrition and delay. It demanded a small adjustment and another ring of iron seeds. The sailor's way of measuring this was not in equations, though the equations were there, but in the feeling of the deck underfoot. You did not widen your circle like a dog chasing its tail in snow. You stayed on the line. Let the operator's voice take on that quiet urgency that means the contact plot is improving with each ping, and then you pulled the key again. A ship can be trained to do that as surely as a hand can be trained to thread a needle on a rolling table. There is a temptation to stop at the projectile and the frame and declare the thing explained, but that would ignore the essential, unsentimental truth of all war machines. They only live to the degree that procedures make them inevitable. Hedgehog was inevitable because it made the user complicit in its logic. Once you bolted it to a bow, and trained a crew to a competence that wasn't glamorous enough to brag about. The device rewrote the schedule of the hunt. The schedule is where victory takes its walks. 20 seconds from splash to a meaningful depth, 40 seconds to learn more, 60 seconds to fire again. This was not merely acceptable, it was addictive. Captains who had learned to distrust their own impulses to do something grand now felt the seduction of doing something correct. Human factors, the quiet tyrants of every system, were on the right side for once. There is a final, almost tender feature that explains the machine's authority. The explosion is small and private. When it happens, it does not implicate the sky. It does not bend the horizon. It does not make the ship feel like a sinner forgiven by noise. It marks a moment between the projectile and the hull and keeps its voice to that moment. Crews learned to love that sound precisely because it was not the intoxicant they had once sought. It was the sound of the ocean admitting a fact. After months of being lied to by froth and concussion, men remember the first time the sea told them the truth quickly enough to matter. If you want to draw a straight line from a piece of welded steel on a forecastle to a change in the strategic temperature of the North Atlantic, start at that sound and ask why systems that tell the truth are always underestimated by people who prefer weapons that shout. Hedgehog, in the end, is not a myth to be narrated but a method to be repeated. A spigot and a ring, a projectile that refuses to perform if it cannot confirm, a bow that keeps its nose in the story, an operator who treats each ping like a sentence that could end the paragraph, "This is not romance," and that is why it worked. If depth charges were a ceremony designed to comfort the attacker, Hedgehog was a habit designed to dismantle the enemy. Habits survive weather. Ceremonies have schedules. Habits have half-lives. In the cold black water between Greenland and Ireland, half-lives decide which hulls make it to morning. Tactics do not change because an admiral signs an order. They change because the sea makes an argument and a few stubborn men refuse to stop listening. In the grey rooms of the western approaches, where maps were pinned into the plaster like butterflies and coffee tasted of ship's paint, the argument became unbearable by 1942. Escorts could find submarines, often enough to give hope a shift's worth of oxygen, and yet the ledger stayed wrong. Tons went down that should have arrived. The Black Pit earned its name not because it was dark, which the whole ocean is at 3 in the morning, but because it was a region where information went to die. Air cover was thin and far between, re-attack delays bred by the old depth, charge schedule were luxuries the convoy system could no longer afford. The men responsible for turning doctrine into reflex did not need prophecy. They needed a schedule that kept truth alive from the first ping to the last detonation. Hedgehog offered the mechanism. The schools at Western approaches wrote the manners. What changed first was not the directive, but the posture. The phrase, "drive through the datum," moved from a chalkboard aphorism to a body memory. Captains had to learn to keep the bow aimed at the thing men most wanted to flinch from. It sounds like a slogan, but slogans are what remain after a truth has forced its way into the blood. The old pattern in on bearing, drop your barrels, sheer off, wait out the blinding mess you have made satisfied fear's demand for action. The new pattern close on bearing, project the ring ahead, remain on bearing, listen through the silence you have preserved, satisfied the mathematics. In classrooms, the geometry acquired the same plainness as rules about hatches and fire. Teachers did not baptize students in poetry, they wrote figures. Bearing rate times, closing speed, equals the moment when the ellipse of fall must be centered where the boat will be, not where your last range said it was. Average sink rate of the projectile measured against the target's likely dive angle equals the depth window where a contact fuse becomes a promise instead of a wish. Time to reload measured against the friction of the crew equals the number of re-attacks a man can fit into the minute a disciplined U-boat uses to complicate your life. Doctrine is the long word we use for a set of micro-decisions that repeat until they feel like instinct. Western approaches turned those micro-decisions into muscle. The classroom voice has its limits, and the sea has a way of erasing the chalk as soon as the first squall plays a joke with the horizon. That is why sea trials became theatre of a necessary kind, controlled contacts, escort groups rehearsing the new posture until the tongue and the hand spoke the same language. In these trials, Azdic operators learned a new composure. They were no longer the tragic poets of a set that sang beautifully, then went mute under the roar of their own side's fury. They became accountants of seconds, tallying the contact's integrity from ping to ping, measuring a tiny drift in bearing against a tiny adjustment of helm, keeping their voices level because level voices conserve energy. On the forecastle, the projector crews found the rhythm pull a ring of iron seeds into the world. Watch the water accept them without complaint. Listen, reload, listen, pull another ring. You can almost still hear the exhalations in the training recordings. Not relief, not fear, but a soft punctuation when silence returns after the splash and the men realize silence is, at last, an advantage on their side. Doctrine forced changes in how ships spoke to themselves. The loop from bridge to Azdic to projector deck tightened, and then tightened again. Orders that once came packaged in full sentences shrank to their bone nouns and verbs because fewer words mean less time lost and fewer places for doubt to hide. A captain did not need to say, "We will maintain this course through the contact and ready the projector for firing. Do not break off." He could say, "Hold, ready, hold." The operator did not need to cover his own uncertainty with description. He could give the facts. Bearing steady. Range closing. The projector crew did not ask for reassurance. They reported the state and awaited the key. Procedure ate ceremony, and the men did not go hungry. There were resistances, naturally. Some of them were philosophical men who had built their professional souls on the old rituals, felt that silence could not possibly be aggressive, that a fight required a bang to be real. Some were mechanical. The early projector frames had personalities that demanded respect, and crews had to prove to themselves that the apparatus would not embarrass them under weather that was already unkind. Some were cultural. The swagger of "fill the sea with thunder" had to make room for the strangeness of "let the sea talk." Western approaches solved those resistances, the only way doctrine ever solves anything. Repetition until the body gives up its last doubt. In logs from the period, the transition can be read as a drift in vocabulary. Phrases like "heavy pattern expended" lose their frequency. Phrases like "fired ahead," "re-attacked immediately" begin to accumulate. It is unfashionable to say so, but language is where war becomes real. The ships were learning to speak the new war as they fought it. The enemy noticed. They always do, though they never admit it in the first season. The U-boat arm had reaction drills that, on paper, should have remained adequate. Put up a bold decoy to generate a blonde trail of bubbles louder than you are. Make a sharp turn to produce a knuckle of water that confuses the bearing. Adjust depth fast enough that the last known plot must be wrong by the time the enemy arrives with his fire. Those drills relied on a predictable gap in the enemy's attention, imposed by the enemy's own weapon. Hedgehog removed the gap, and Western approaches doctrine refused to give it back out of habit. The steady, unlovely pings did not grant the underwater captain his old interval of grace. Men who have practiced holding their breath during the length of a blast suddenly found they were being timed in a different currency, one measured not by the lungs but by a metronome. There is a tendency, when celebrating a doctrinal triumph, to pretend it happened all at once, to compress into a single heroic captain or a single demonstration what actually took hundreds of small decisions spread across ships, ports, and corridors where men argued in polite tones and then went home cold. The better story, the truer one, is that the doctrine shifted because small truths were let into the room and not asked to leave. The small truth that a miss in silence is a gift and not a humiliation. The small truth that an operator is braver when he keeps talking than when he waits. The small truth that an explosion that means something is preferable to a dozen that mean nothing. The small truth that attention is a more renewable resource than courage when the night runs long. By the time support groups began to patrol with this reflex in their bones, an escort commander could feel the difference the way a musician feels, a band lock into tempo. Contact gained, bow aimed, ring thrown, silence preserved, decision made, Re-attack, immediate. The sea still had its moods, and the enemy still had his luck, but both had less room to operate. The Atlantic did not become friendly. It became legible for longer stretches, and legibility is lethal to a submarine that relies on a hunter's confusion to make its own cleverness seem larger than it is. That is the real victory of doctrine, not that it makes men superhuman, but that it makes the environment less random for long enough that ordinary bravery can find its way to a result. If you walk the corridors of those schools in your mind, the chalk dust will settle on your shoulders and make you cough. The maps will whisper prosecuting lines across nowhere. You will see a sentence written in a hand that has slept too little. Do not break contact to attack. It is a modest instruction, as humble as a dishcloth hung to dry, and it overthrows a tradition. That is the difference between strategy and superstition. Strategy touches the tool that changed the equation and then changes the hands that will use it until the hands forget the older way existed. Western approaches did not merely teach men a new machine. It taught them to enjoy the feeling of a night in which every decision is only the next step in an argument the sea is already losing. And that is the verdict of doctrine. The moment you teach a fleet to protect its information like a flame cupped in a gale, you shorten the war not by days you can put on a calendar, but by minutes you can feel on a deck. Those minutes are where ships live or drown. Those minutes are where a new kind of silence, engineered on a forecastle and rehearsed in a classroom, begins to sound like mercy to convoys and like doom to boats. The sea had spent the evening changing its mind. Wind slackened at dusk and returned after midnight. Swell crossed swell and made the surface a restless quilt. The convoy held its stubborn grid and the escorts worked the edges with a patience born from training rather than hope. In the small hours, an Azdic set that had been muttering all night returned something clean, bearing steady, range closing, the simple grammar of a target that is not a rumour. The operator kept his voice level because that steadiness is contagious, and the bridge answered with a course correction that drove the bow through the datum instead of shearing off for spectacle. On the forecastle, the Hedgehog's tubes coughed 24 iron seeds into the dark, and the ship ran into its own silence, which is the most valuable possession in this kind of fight. Below, the U-boat was behind schedule, and cross at everything. Batteries were sulking. A valve had eaten an hour, and the captain had missed the twilight window he wanted. He eased depth a handful of meters, and turned across the bearing because the old ritual said that was clever. Confuse the plot, ride out the blind interval, let the charges thunder overhead where you're not. But the ping didn't pause to honor his choreography. The ocean stayed legible. The first contact detonation arrived like a hammer tapped by a careful hand, sharp, near, unambiguous. A second and a third followed in a short cascade that convinced everyone above that the math had been right and convinced everyone below that the math had changed. On the bridge, no one cheered. Doctrine had replaced theatre. They held the line through the echoes, watched the set keep its poise, and fired again not because they needed drama, but because they refused to surrender seconds. The ship did not wander into a wide circle. It stayed on the argument. When the water finished speaking, there was air on the surface that had no business being there, and wreckage that didn't require legend to be understood. The time card for the entire sequence fit on a margin. Minutes from first firm contact to first salvo. Seconds from splash to first hit. Under a minute to a decision that could be written in a log without adjectives. That brevity was the miracle. In the control room, habit collided with a new schedule. Men reached for levers in the order they had practiced, and found the boat answering with a stiffness that meant her shape had been altered in places that matter. There was no interval to buy options. The captain had the right instincts and the wrong century. He was trying to make theatre in a room that had become an office. When the lights steadied, and the man at the set reported silence where a return should be, the escort's bridge allowed itself the smallest luxury available at sea, a single breath released without superstition. This is how weapons become habits. The first confirmed kill didn't need fanfare, it needed to be repeatable. It proved that an ahead-throwing pattern could be laid on a volume of probability fast enough to beat evasion, that contact-only blasts preserved the ship's senses, and that a miss was not a delay but an instruction for the next shot. By dawn, the convoy had advanced through a night that would have eaten more time and tonnage under the old ritual. No one said the war had changed. They said the night had finally behaved. That sentence, repeated across ships and weeks, is how the temperature of an ocean turns. Hedgehog's power lies in a dull truth that defeats glamorous lies. Information has value per second. The weapon exists to protect that value. Forward throw keeps the target inside the sonar's attention instead of beyond it. Contact fuses refuse to blind the set for the sake of noise. The pattern is not guesswork performed with confidence. It is an ellipse sized to embrace bearing error while leaving a 19-foot beam little room to wriggle through without paying for contact. Everything else follows from that discipline. The geometry is a ledger. A closing course holds the echo in the center of the beam. A computed footprint lands where the latest truth, not the last memory, says the submarine will be. A projectile that sinks on the order of 20 feet per second transforms seconds into depth in a way that beats most disciplined dives. 10 seconds to about 200 feet, 15 to 300, 20 to 400. That tempo is the escort's ally. Because the warheads do not detonate unless they touch steel, the water remains readable after a miss and brutally clear after a hit. In either case, the system gives the crew an immediate answer: fire again with a tightened plot, or move on because the ocean has already acknowledged the result. Pattern density replaces sharpshooting with probability management. Crews learn to love zones rather than dots. An ellipse wide enough to forgive a few degrees of bearing error and dense enough to punish a cross-datum turn makes cleverness expensive for the boat below. Reload rhythm turns from drudgery into cadence. Splash, listen, reload, listen, splash again. The bridge stops performing courage and executes competence. The operator stops narrating apologies for bubbles and becomes a metronome with a purpose. When the ship's own weapon does not erase its sensors, men's attention migrates from spectacle to truth, and attention is the only renewable fuel on a long night. Human factors complete the circuit. Crews are greedy for fast feedback because fast feedback kills superstition. A contact detonation is small, local, and decisive. A miss is silent and instructive instead of humiliating. That emotional economy keeps operators calm, captains conservative with flourishes, and projector crews efficient in weather that punishes hands. The numbers move accordingly. Per-attack success improves because the platform can execute re-attacks inside the same minute. Attacks per kill falls because fewer runs are squandered on blindness. None of that requires magic. It requires a ship that refuses to pay for misses with chaos and refuses to confuse thunder with progress. Imagine the bow held steady into a hard night while the set keeps count. The ring goes out with the clipped coughs of valves. The water accepts without lying. The crew listens for a truth that arrives on a schedule short enough to matter. What changes isn't merely lethality but morale. Men who can trust their instrument's next sentence do not need to manufacture belief with explosions. They can work. Machines change wars only when they change manners. Hedgehog did so by making silence useful and speed honest. The control room had a smell that could make a man remember it in his sleep, oil, and damp insulation and nerves. In that space, the old ritual was the only religion that ever paid. Brace through the first pattern, count out the polled, roaring interval while the hunter goes deaf, spend those seconds on a dive and a turn, throw a decoy to write lies into his plot, and emerge on the far side with choices. The first thing Hedgehog took was the interval. The ping kept arriving, tidy and rude, while the captain tried to make a decision in the old silence that no longer existed. He turned hard to throw a surface knuckle, eased the bow down to a depth that would have eaten the heart out of a conventional pattern, and signaled for a decoy he'd saved for just this hour. He was disciplined and on time. The new schedule wasn't. The detonation, when it came, was almost modest, a single pulse that bent knees and changed everyone's understanding of where their body ended and the boat began. Instruments, which usually have manners, twitched with an intimacy that said, "Contact, not weather." A second pulse erased a superstition. There would be no loud pause, no forgiving blindness above. The captain's words came out in the right sequence and the wrong century. Depth, angle, speed. The boat replied like an animal protecting a wound. Every clever move was observed because the hunter had chosen a weapon that allowed observation to continue. Evasion became a ledger of charges rather than a performance in the dark. The crew felt the humiliation peculiar to professionals who discover that their finest habits have been scheduled out of relevance. They tried new emphases, jagged accelerations instead of neat maneuvers, deeper excursions that punished batteries and men to buy a few seconds of misalignment, decoys saved for later in the sequence, when earlier doctrine would have spent them, but the loop above was shorter than the loop below. Missed, re-attacked, arrived faster than the boat could reinvent herself. Luck worked once in a while and fooled a few into thinking it was design. The next escort, trained to avoid believing in luck as a plan, cancelled that experiment in a minute. From the U-boat side of the glass, the change could be charted without maps. Long, survivable intervals collapsing into short, unforgiving sequences. Captains who once cultivated gamblers' patience forced into real-time engineering, morale becoming a function of how long the ping kept time. The old dance steps, knuckles, dives, decoys were still performed because bodies don't forget. But they looked like last year's moves to a song that had shifted 2 beats forward. There is no shame in failing physics. There is only the knowledge that physics has no shame either. Hedgehog did not make the ocean hostile. It made it punctual. A captain who had learned to turn noise into sanctuary found that sanctuary repossessed. The boat's savings of nerve, which had covered 100 small debts to luck, could not pay a bill that charged on contact. In his bunk afterward, a petty officer trying to explain the new fear said only that the explosions were closer and the ping never apologized. That is nearly the whole truth. The rest is paperwork and graphs and convoys that arrived with more hulls than pessimists had promised. One night can be chalked up to grace. A season cannot. The months when Hedgehog stopped being a clever extra and became the pulse of an escort war were marked by convoy fights in which the tempo felt engineered rather than improvised. The difference lived in sequences. An outer escort took a clean contact and didn't squander it on a circle. The bow stayed in, the ring went out, silence stayed readable. If the first pattern hit, the narrative ended quickly and the convoy kept its pace. If it missed, the second pattern went within the same minute, while the operator's voice improved the plot. The submarine below could be brilliant, but brilliance is a poor trade against a clock that never stops. Support groups stitched these moments together like a conductor balancing sections of an orchestra. One ship held contact while another attacked. Then they swapped. Then a third arrived and simplified rather than complicated. In the depth charge era, that handoff happened in water that had just been taught to lie. In the Hedgehog era, it happened in water that still spoke the language of bearings and ranges. The effect was not louder victories, but shorter ones. A pack that should have savaged a convoy out in the black pit found itself lunging rather than stalking, burning battery in bursts that accomplished less than the old slow approach, over-communicating on radios because tempo anxiety always breeds talk. Escorts, trained to husband attention like fuel, prosecuted serial contacts without stumbling into fatigue spirals that used to ruin a watch. Reports changed tone. Expended heavy patterns faded, fired ahead, maintained contact, re-attacked, contact explosions, appeared like a new kind of weather. The graphs in shivering offices ashore were even plainer. Attacks per kill down, time from first contact to decision down. Percentage of immediate re-attacks up, explosive expenditure per finished fight down. War rarely allows lines that clean. When it does, you would be a fool not to point at them. The convoy's lived experience matched the graphs. Panic reduced from a flood to a tide. Ships that would have been peeled away by a determined pack stayed in formation because the escorts did not waste minutes believing in thunder. Enemy adaptation proved the same point by failing in public. Packs that had once moved like choreographed choruses turned into clumsy solos as captains misjudged a timing they no longer controlled. The absence of a blind interval removed their favorite currency. A boat that survived the first minute often could not survive the third. A commander who found a trick on Tuesday met an escort on Thursday, trained to erase tricks with procedure. The Atlantic didn't become kind. It became coherent for long enough stretches that industrial logistics could trust it. That trust, measured in hours saved and hulls preserved, is the victory Hedgehog purchased with small explosions that meant something and long silences that could be read. In the end, proof looked exactly like paperwork. Clean time cards, terse sentences, convoys arriving with one more column intact than the pessimists had budgeted. The weapon did not make heroes unnecessary. It made heroics less wasteful. It did not end the hunting. It ended the theatre. That is how you change a war without changing the weather. You change the schedule, and then you keep it. Factories are a kind of shipyard for ideas. You load raw ore and drawings at one end and try to sail doctrine out the other. Hedgehog's rise was possible not just because it worked, but because it could be made by hands that had never seen a submarine and fitted to bows that had never dreamed of throwing a pattern ahead. In sheds that smelled of hot steel and tea, welders laid frames on jigs the way cobblers fit uppers to soles, repetition and fixtures, making reliability out of human variation. The projector was forgiving. Short tubes, stout spigots, a frame that could be shimmed and bolted without asking a small navy of machinists to come bless it. Ammunition lockers were simple boxes. The projectile itself could be fabricated in parts, shipped in crates, assembled without ceremony. An escort that paused at a working pier could take on a whole new way of fighting in an afternoon and sail before the paint was dry. Procurement officers, who measure victory in spreadsheets while pretending they don't, loved the curve, low tooling complexity, high training payoff. A ship-fit team could arrive with a truck, weld the mount, route a cable, test the firing circuit, leave a laminated card with procedures, and be gone before the tide turned. Once fitted, a ship's internal economy improved. Reload drills did not require exotic skills, only a rhythm. The supply chain did not choke on rare metals or delicate parts. It absorbed fins and fuses at the tempo builders could sustain. The weapon's modest appetite for mass and maintenance meant it could coexist with everything else. A crowded forecastle had to carry paravanes, anchors, guns without forcing commanders into the kind of trade-offs that start fights ashore. Industry does not only multiply, it iterates. As escorts grew fluent in the ahead-throwing grammar, designers pressed for variants that stressed different verbs. Hedgehog had written the thesis contact-only explosions in a forward-thrown ellipse, keep the water honest on a miss. Squid arrived like a postscript with muscle. Larger projectiles projected farther and deeper. A depth-fused trio that fell in synchronous geometry toward a calculated meeting with a hull, the ship's sonar now part of a feedback loop that predicted not just where the submarine was, but where it would be in the seconds it took explosives to arrive. Squid did not replace the lesson Hedgehog taught. It exaggerated it. Weapons spoke to sets. Sets spoke to fire control. Men sat in the circuit and learned to trust the numbers more than the night. On the factory floor, the difference between the two families looked like more steel and more machining. On the water, it sounded like a conversation that had learned new words. With Squid, the ship's brain and the mortar's muscle agreed on a depth. With Hedgehog, the sea agreed only when steel kissed steel. Crews learned to love both truths, the decisive intimacy of a contact detonation and the stern finality of a timed one. The iteration bred confidence because it bred choice. A commander could select his sentence depending on the target's grammar. A deep diver, trying to outrun geometry, welcomed a weapon that arrived at a depth set by calculation. A clever boat trying to dance around, a bearing welcomed a ring of iron seeds that demanded proof. None of this mattered if ships could not be kept in ammunition. The projectile production line, once it found its stride, fed escorts the way bakeries feed cities. Pallets of finned cylinders rolled down ramps to lorries that ran routes as familiar as milk deliveries. Fuse workshops did their meticulous work behind doors with signs that scolded against haste and sloppiness. The sea is unforgiving. Fuses must be too. In depot yards, petty officers counted crates and tried not to think about where the steel would go when it left their sight. On decks at speed, loaders counted rounds off to the letter because counting is what keeps fear from inventing work. And then there is the human workshop. The place doctrine is actually made. Training schools folded hedgehog and squid into curricula as if they'd always been there. Instructors clicked stopwatches while crews loaded and fired without shouting. Classrooms taught the difference between a silence that instructs and a silence that accuses. Shore tanks and trial ranges turned tables of pattern footprints into moving pictures lodged behind eyelids. Fleet captains, skeptical of anything that looked like a gadget, accepted the iteration because the iteration had already improved their nights. The effect was compounding: more mounts installed, more crews trained, more kills per attack, more belief in the schedule that spared ships from theatre. Industry delivered hardware, iteration delivered manners. Together they delivered tempo. By the time the new weapons were commonplace, the ocean felt different along the convoy lanes. It did not become mild, it became measurable. A ship with a forward projector and a crew drilled into the habit of keeping contact did not make the sea smaller. It made the problem it faced smaller per unit time. That is how industries and inventions conspire to trick geography, not by flattening distance, but by compressing uncertainty. Hedgehog opened the door by proving a weapon could be honest with its own sensors. Squid walked through by tying explosives to predictions. The factory's role in that walk is not romantic, which is why it tends to be omitted in stories told for applause. It is, however, the hinge. Without steel, you have intent. Without intent, steel is scrap. Together, they move tonnage and change wars. Every strategy has a ledger that survives its speeches. In the Atlantic, the ledger was not only sunk tonnage and hulls protected, but the speed and efficiency with which a contact could be turned into a decision. Hedgehog pushed the columns into new alignments. Per-attack kill probability climbed from the soggy single digits common to stern-dropped depth charges to rates that crews could feel in their knuckles 1 in 4 on good nights, better in trained hands and fair weather, worse in storms, but persistently above the old ritual. The number mattered because it governed attention. If a ship could expect a decision in fewer runs, it could plan its watch, fuel, and nerves on a different timetable. Attacks per kill fell accordingly. Where early war escorts could expend 10 or 20 patterns and still write no conclusive evidence, Hedgehog let them close accounts in a handful of engagements, with the crucial difference that misses did not charge interest in blindness. Time from first clean contact to decision shrank from hours to minutes. The long loop of reacquire, replot, reset, expended those weary lines in a night's log began to vanish. In their place, fired ahead, silence maintained, re-attacked, contact explosions. The quiet between those clauses is as important as the numbers. Silence transformed from a penalty to a resource. The set could be trusted to keep speaking. Fitting rates rose, and with them a fleet's character. When a significant fraction of escorts in a group carried ahead-throwing weapons, the pack's calculus changed. A U-boat entering a screen no longer faced a single geometry but many, a choreography of bows pointed in and voices steady on the net. One escort's miss no longer gave the enemy his old interval, because another ship could be holding the thread with instruments unblinded. Serial prosecutions became routine where they had been luxury. Every additional mount installed multiplied this effect without shouting about it. The ocean noticed because time noticed. The Atlantic's secret is that it pays compound interest on minutes saved and fines you for minutes wasted. Cruises' training hours showed up in the numbers too. Operators drilled to hear bearing rate as a living thing kept contacts fat with truth. Projector crews drilled until reload was a wrist's memory, not a thought that stole attention from the set. Captains drilled out of the habit of shearing off and into the habit of through the datum. The math responded in kind, more immediate re-attacks within a minute, fewer cases of lost contact after attack, a steady fall in explosive expenditure per conclusive engagement. Even the ugly numbers bent. U-boat losses during the months when ahead-throwing weapons crested on the lanes formed a curve that pinched ambition. Captains who had once built careers on endurance discovered that endurance was no longer the right variable. Longevity belongs to those who waste fewer seconds. Skeptics ashore could try to argue the anecdotes, but they could not argue the graph. It is possible to dress up or dress down any individual night. It is difficult to falsify a fleet's tempo when measured across escorts and months. When analysts pinned timelines and outcomes to walls and drew lines through them, the slope respected Hedgehog. The weapon did not conjure certainty where none existed. It cut the price of doubt. That price is what logistics lives and dies on. Fewer minutes per kill where kills were earned. Fewer hours expended on misses that taught nothing. Fewer ships condemned to coast through a blacking out of senses because their own explosions had made the sea unreadable. This is dull to talk about until you are counting hulls in port and seeing columns arrive intact. The U-boat arm ran its fingers down the same columns in its own fearful way. It measured fuel burned, running re-attack loops that never arrived because the attacker never went blind. It measured battery drained fighting in close for minutes that once would have been spent in quiet flight. It measured the turn from collective operations to lonely deaths, the way a pack pans into separate tragedies when doctrine fails to supply a shared tempo. Numbers, at sea, end up as moods aboard boats. The mood shifted from arrogant patience to anxious improvisation, and anxious improvisation is expensive. If you had to choose a single statistic to write on the cover of a report, it would be the one that polite men call reaction time. Hedgehog shortened it for the hunter and stole it from the hunted. That is a strategy in a sentence. Technology never lands in an empty room. It barges into a crowd of habits, superstitions, jokes, fears, and the small hacks men use to keep their hands steady when waves insist on moving everything that matters. Hedgehog succeeded because it changed moods as much as it changed math. On escorts, the most important change was a transfer of faith from noise to information. Depth charges had taught sailors that action equals sound, and sound equals progress. Hedgehog asked them to accept a different catechism. Action equals preserved contact. Preserved contact equals progress. That takes nerve in bad weather at 3 a.m. It takes leaders willing to model quiet. Bridge teams learned to speak less and say more. Orders shrank into clean verbs because the ship's posture did not need to be argued, only maintained. There is a peculiar bravery in holding a course through a squall of instinct, and crews began to respect that bravery because it produced results quickly enough to reinforce itself. Sonar operators, often the youngest men in the most important chairs, found their job turned from nervous, waiting into continuous, of authorship. Their pings wrote the minutes. Each miss that did not explode into chaos taught them to trust that their next sentence would be legible. Each hit that announced itself with a precise, localized concussion taught them that the ocean could, occasionally, be honest. On the projector deck, procedure became a shelter rather than a drudgery. Reload drills had always been physical. Now they were moral too. To move quickly inside silence without breaking, it is to believe that silence is your ally. Men who had once gloried in the idea of giving the sea a bellyful began to speak fondly of keeping the set clean, a phrase that would have sounded like cowardice in the old catechism and now sounded like competence. Even superstition adjusted. Charms stayed in pockets, but the hand reached for the firing key with a restraint that looked like superstition's twin and turned out to be geometry's friend. The change aboard U-boats was harsher because it required unlearning under punishment. Crews built identities on having survived the depth charge theatre. They had practiced the posture of endurance until it felt like character. Hedgehog told them that character expressed as passivity was now a liability. Their officers, proud and quiet men for whom the old rituals were proof of worth, found themselves preaching improvisations that sounded like apologies. There is no quicker solvent for morale than the discovery that you are brave in the wrong way. The ping that never stopped became a metronome for doubt. The small, close detonations were humiliations because they were personal. They did not flatter anyone with spectacle. A miss that stayed silent offered no drama to narrate later. It offered only the knowledge that the hunter would try again with better information. No enemy can flatter your ego into survival when the conditions of flattery have been removed. Procedure and psychology are Siamese twins. Western approaches schools did not only teach angles, they taught voices. Instructors insisted on tone because tone preserves attention. They insisted on ritual because ritual spares the cortex for decisions. They insisted on a ship that sounded like an instrument being played well, rather than a room full of excited men. The payoffs were cumulative and quiet. Officers slept better in the hours they were allowed because the watch had not exhausted itself on fireworks. Crews began to believe that their night would be shorter if they behaved, and that belief made them more likely to behave. A navy lives on that sort of feedback loop. As for ethics, the place where men stare at themselves afterward, the silence helped there too. It is easier to believe you are doing necessary work when your weapon speaks only on contact and otherwise lets the sea tell the truth. Grand detonations that announce themselves miles away carry the old burden of theatre and its temptations. Small explosions that declare steel met steel end arguments faster. The moral relief is real, if rarely mentioned. You are not making noise to feel brave. You are making proof to feel finished. That distinction, multiplied across thousands of nights, is a mercy to the men who must carry those nights home. In the end, crews trusted the silence because the silence delivered. It delivered decisions quickly. It delivered a tempo they could sustain. It delivered a story that matched the facts. The old story had required inflation to protect the soul. The new story required only attention. Attention is the bravest thing you can pay at sea because there is always a cheaper alternative. Hedgehog made attention affordable. Most revolutions at sea are noisy when they happen and quiet when they last. Hedgehog was the reverse. A quiet event that made a persistent noise in the ledgers that matter. Its legacy is not only in steel, though you can trace a line from those stubby tubes to Squid's synchronized trios and onward to ASROC flinging torpedoes, far ahead, and from there to rocket-delivered weapons that yoke sensors to shooters as if the ocean were transparent, but in the way navies came to think about their problems. The lesson was modest and total. Never pay for your own attack with your own blindness. Never confuse volume for probability. Never let theatre rent space that should belong to timelines. Post-war. The line continues in systems that treat contact as an asset portfolio to be managed per second. Sonars grew deeper brains. Fire. Control systems learned to predict instead of admire. Weapons obeyed the schedule rather than demanding it be torn up for their convenience. The surface picture changed least to the eye. Small crews on small decks still loaded stubby cylinders into stubby mouths. What changed was the authority those cylinders had over procedures. Weapons became clauses in sentences written by sets and plots. Officers became editors rather than poets, cutting adjectives where they bloated meaning, enforcing cadence where nerves would have rushed. When future generations met submarines far quicker and quieter than anything that ever rode out of keel, the answer did not begin with bigger explosions. It began with the same quiet heresy. Keep contact, strike inside that contact, measure the result, repeat. There is a political legacy too, muted but real. Democracies do not maintain enthusiasm for long, inconclusive campaigns waged by heroics alone. They require results measurable on calendars and receipts. Hedgehog shortened arguments in rooms far from the spray. Convoys arrived. Insurance rates budged. Rail yards emptied and filled to schedules that matched promises. This is not romance. It is statecraft. And statecraft runs on the confidence that routine will be respected by reality more often than not. An ahead-throwing mortar mounted to 100 humble bows taught reality to behave in small, repeatable ways, and in those increments empires breathe. For the men who lived it, legacy is simpler. It is the memory that their profession ceased to be a play, staged for fear, and became a craft performed for truth. The enemy noticed and wrote their own elegies, though not in public. U-boat memoirs, when they tell the truth, acknowledge a moment when the gulf between their doctrine and the hunters narrowed to a slit and then closed. The silence on misses and the surgical certainty on hits did more than sink hulls. They sunk a style. In the years after, when naval architects drew new submarines and new counters, They did so knowing the days of loud persuasion were shrinking. The fight would be decided by who could keep a thread of data unbroken longest and who would consent to work inside the tempos that honesty imposed. If you need one sentence to carry away, it can be this: Hedgehog didn't make the ocean safe. It made the ocean solvable. Safety is a political promise and a poet's lie. Solvable is a ship captain's prayer. The weapon was small. Its blasts were small. Its effect on a night was huge. It taught an industrial fleet that patience married to precision outruns, fury married to hope. It replaced a theology of thunder with a practice of proof. And because navies remember what lets them rest, its descendants stand ready wherever bows slice cold water, and operators listen for a ping that may be the difference between rumor and result. The mathematics of war did not begin on that forecastle, but there the math learned to keep time, and once time is yours, the rest of the ocean must negotiate.